The sound of shattering glass was a symphony of power. It echoed down the quiet street, a sharp, percussive retort to the insult that had been delivered to the Megumi. Rio stood on the opposite pavement, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored charcoal coat, his face a mask of sculpted indifference. The cold night air bit at his exposed skin, but he felt nothing. Inside, there was only a frozen calm, the placid surface of a deep and dangerous lake. His men were efficient, brutal instruments of his will. They moved through the small shop, petal and stem, with a practiced violence, overturning shelves of terracotta pots, splintering the pale wood of the main counter, and tearing down the delicate paper lanterns that had hung from the ceiling. He watched as a wave of green and vibrant color was systematically reduced to a trampled, muddy ruin. The sweet, cloying scent of crushed lilies and snapped hyacinths filled the air, a grotesque perfume of destruction. It was meant to be a message, simple and clear. An associate of a rival clan had been seen making a purchase here earlier in the week. In Rio's world, proximity was complicity. The florist, whoever they were, had become a piece of collateral, a meaningless detail in a much larger, bloodier conversation. He had given the order without a second thought, the same way one might swat a fly. It was business. It was control. Then she appeared. A figure emerged from the back room, drawn out by the cacophony. She was young, perhaps 22, a slender African-American woman in a simple gray dress, her form partially obscured by a white apron smudged with dirt. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face of stunning clarity, now frozen in disbelief. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out or beg. She simply stopped in the doorway of her ruined sanctuary and stood perfectly still, her eyes sweeping over the devastation. It was her silence that snagged his attention. Amidst the chaos of his men's work, her stillness was a defiant anchor. It was unnerving. It was a variable he hadn't accounted for. One of his men, Kenji, turned to look at her, a length of wood in his hand, hesitating. Rio gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The message was sent. Their work was done. The men filed out, their faces impassive, melting back into the shadows of the waiting black cars. Rio's gaze lingered on the woman for a moment longer. She took a slow, deliberate step into the wreckage, her worn boots crunching on shards of glass and fallen blossoms. She knelt, her movements graceful and pained, and picked up a single, miraculously intact white rose from the floor. She held it as if it were the most precious object in the world. For the first time that night, a flicker of something uncomfortable, something entirely foreign, stirred in the frozen lake of Rio's soul. He turned away, dismissing it, and slid into the back of his car. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing him back inside his world of steel and silence. The scent of ruined flowers, however, seemed to follow him. Lena felt the vibrations of the departing cars through the soles of her shoes. The sudden silence that descended was heavier, more suffocating, than the noise had been. She knelt on the floor, the cold of the concrete seeping through the thin fabric of her dress, and stared at the white rose in her hand. Its petals were perfect, unbruised, a small miracle of survival in a sea of ruin. This shop was more than a business. It was the physical manifestation of a promise she had made to her grandmother, a woman who had taught her that beauty could be cultivated in the harshest of soils. Every plank of reclaimed wood, every carefully selected vase, every seed she had ever nurtured into life, was a testament to that belief. Now, it lay in splinters and shards around her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the tragic sweetness of destroyed blooms. It smelled like a funeral, her funeral. She had poured every dollar of her savings, every ounce of her energy, into this place. It was her haven from a city that was often loud, abrasive, and indifferent. Here, she could create small pockets of peace for people. An anniversary bouquet. A single stem to brighten a hospital room. A wreath to honor a life lost. She had believed, perhaps naively, that the simple act of fostering life and beauty would insulate her from the city's casual cruelty. Tonight had shattered that illusion as completely as the front window. A figure appeared in the broken frame of the doorway. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly owner of the bakery next door, his face etched with worry.
Lena?
My dear girl, I heard. I called the police. They're on their way. He stepped carefully inside, his eyes wide with horror as he took in the full scope of the damage. Who would do this? Why? Lena looked up at him, the white rose still clutched in her hand. She had no answers. The violence felt so impersonal, so random. It was a storm that had descended without warning and left just as quickly, leaving her to deal with the wreckage. I don't know, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He reached out a trembling, flour-dusted hand and placed it on her shoulder. Let me help you, he said, his voice thick with sympathy. She gave him a weak, grateful smile and finally allowed a single tear to trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She carefully placed the resilient white rose in a cup of water on a small, untouched shelf, a solitary beacon of hope in the darkness. They can break the glass, she said, her voice finding a sliver of its strength. But they can't kill the roots. Rio stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment, the sprawling city lights a glittering carpet of cold fire below. The view was one of absolute power, a testament to the empire his father had built and that he now commanded. The buildings were monoliths of concrete and steel, their rigid geometry a reflection of the world he inhabited, a world of unbending rules, brutal hierarchies, and swift consequences. There was no room for softness here. Softness was a weakness to be exploited, a vulnerability to be cut out like a cancer. The destruction of the flower shop had been a necessary surgical strike, a cauterization of a potential threat. And yet, the satisfaction he usually felt after asserting his dominance was absent. In its place was a hollow echo, a disquiet that clung to him like the phantom scent of crushed gardenias. He thought of the woman in the gray dress, her silence, the way she had cradled that single, unbroken flower. It was an image that refused to fade, an unwelcome piece of art hung in the sterile gallery of his mind. In his life, reactions were predictable. People screamed, they begged, they cursed, they cowered. Her quiet sorrow was something else entirely. It wasn't fear, it was a profound and personal grief, as if his men had desecrated a holy place. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture sharp and dismissive. She was nothing, a footnote in the day's ledger. His focus needed to be elsewhere, on the intricate web of alliances and betrayals that defined his existence. His phone buzzed on the marble tabletop beside him. It was the daily reminder from his assistant. Visit your mother. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a complex knot of duty, guilt, and love. His mother, Yuki, was the last remnant of a different life, a life before the cold armor had been forged around his heart. She lived in the house he'd grown up in, a traditional home with paper screens and a meticulously kept garden, a world away from this glass tower. She was ill, a slow, creeping frailty that he could not fight with money or muscle. He could surround her with the best doctors, the most attentive staff, but he couldn't stop the inevitable. He visited her weekly, bringing extravagant gifts, cashmere throws, expensive orchids flown in from Singapore, rare teas from Kyoto. They were offerings of wealth, not warmth, and they both knew it. He didn't know how to give her what she truly needed, and the failure of it was a constant, low hum of shame beneath the surface of his control. He picked up his keys. It was time to perform his duty, to step out of his world and into hers, a journey that felt longer and more perilous than any other he ever made. Several days later, Rio's car swept through the neighborhood where the florist shop was located. He was on his way to a meeting, his mind occupied with logistics and strategy. As they passed the address, he glanced out the window, expecting to see the storefront boarded up, a dead space waiting for a new tenant. Instead, he saw something that made him lean forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. The broken window was gone, replaced by a large sheet of plywood, but the doorway was open. And in front of it on the pavement was a small, makeshift stand. A collection of mismatched buckets held simple, hardy flowers, bunches of daisies, resilient chrysanthemums, and cheerful sunflowers. On a piece of cardboard, written in neat, elegant script, a sign read, "Still blooming." Lena was there, on her knees, a dustpan and brush in her hand, patiently sweeping the last of the fine glass dust from the corner of the entryway. She wore the same simple gray dress and white apron, now cleaner, but still bearing the faint marks of her labor. She worked with a quiet, focused determination that was utterly captivating. A woman stopped, buying a small bunch of daisies, and Lena smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that briefly transformed her weary face. The transaction was a small act of commerce, but it felt like something more. It felt like a rebellion, a quiet, graceful act of defiance against the brute force he had unleashed upon her. Rio felt that same unsettling flicker from the night of the destruction, but stronger this time. He had leveled her world, and her response was not to flee or to surrender, but to set up a bucket of daisies on the sidewalk. It was a form of strength he couldn't comprehend. It wasn't rooted in fear or intimidation. It was rooted in something deeper, something organic and persistent, like a wildflower pushing its way through a crack in the concrete. He had used a sledgehammer, and she had answered with a seed. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir, is everything all right?" Rio leaned back into the plush leather of the seat, his expression unreadable. "Continue," he commanded, his voice low. But as the car pulled away, he couldn't shake the image of her small stand, a tiny island of stubborn life in the gray expanse of the city sidewalk. The two words, "still blooming," echoed in his mind, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact that somehow undermined the very foundations of his power. The drive to his mother's house was a transition between worlds. The hard edges of the city slowly softened into the gentle, rolling hills of the suburbs. Concrete gave way to ancient trees, their leaves just beginning to blush with the first hints of autumn. When he arrived, he found Yuki not in her bed, as he'd expected, but sitting on the veranda overlooking her garden, a soft wool blanket across her lap. The air was crisp and clean here, a stark contrast to the city's exhaust-filled haze. She looked better than she had in weeks. There was a placid contentment on her face, a light in her eyes that his expensive gifts had never managed to kindle. He noticed it immediately. On the small table beside her sat a simple ceramic vase holding a small, unassuming bouquet. It wasn't a grand arrangement of exotic, flawless blossoms like the ones he sent. This was a humble gathering of wildflowers and greenery, artfully arranged to look as if they were still growing in a meadow. "You look well, Mother," he said, his voice softer than he allowed it to be with anyone else. He placed a small, elegantly wrapped box on the table, another rare tea. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I feel well today, Rio." The sun is warm, her gaze drifted to the bouquet. "Aren't they lovely?" He looked at the flowers again. They were simple. Purple asters, some delicate Queen Anne's lace, and a few strange, bell-shaped flowers with mottled petals he didn't recognize. "They are," he agreed, though he failed to see what was so special about them. "A gift from one of your friends." She shook her head, a secret smile playing on her lips. "From an angel," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "A stranger." He sat down in the chair opposite her, his curiosity piqued. His mother rarely interacted with strangers. Her world had become very small, confined mostly to this house and garden. "Tell me," he urged. She smoothed the blanket over her knees and began to speak, her voice gaining a strength he hadn't heard in a long time. "It was a few weeks ago. I was feeling strong, so I had Kenji drive me into the city. I wanted to walk a little to see the shops. But my medicine, it made me dizzy." The world started to spin, her hand trembled slightly as she recalled the memory. "I stumbled. I thought I was going to fall right there on the pavement. I was so frightened." He felt a surge of cold fear. He had forbidden her from going into the city alone for this very reason. But then, her expression softened again into that gentle, remembering smile. And then she was there. Yuki's eyes took on a distant, grateful glow as she recounted the story. A young woman came rushing out of a little flower shop. She didn't fuss or cause a scene. She just put a steadying arm around me and said, "Let's get you inside for a moment." Her voice was so calm, so kind. Rio listened, his posture rigid, a strange sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. She helped me into a chair in her shop, Yuki continued, and brought me a glass of water. The place was so beautiful, Rio. It smelled of earth and rain and all things that grow. We sat for a while, and she just talked to me, told me about the flowers she was arranging, until the dizziness passed. His mother reached out and gently touched the petal of one of the bell-shaped flowers in the vase. When I was ready to leave, I tried to pay her for her time, for her kindness. But she wouldn't hear of it. She just smiled and disappeared into the back. Yuki paused, her gaze locking with his, her eyes shining with the memory. She came back with this little bouquet. She told me, "Everyone deserves a little bit of brightness to carry with them." She asked for nothing in return. Rio's blood ran cold. He felt a pressure building in his chest, a sickening certainty that was coalescing from the fog of his memory. He had to ask, "This woman, what did she look like, mother?" Yuki's smile was warm. "Oh, she was lovely. A young African-American woman, very graceful. She was wearing a simple gray dress and a white apron, all smudged with soil from her work, the world tilted on its axis." The image from that night slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. The florist, standing silent and devastated amidst the wreckage he had wrought. It was her. He had destroyed the shop of the one person who had shown his ailing mother a moment of pure, selfless compassion. Yuki, oblivious to the storm raging inside him, pointed to the strange, nodding flower. "And she put this one in the center. A hellebore, she called it. The winter rose. She said it was special because it blooms in the harshest cold." The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He, who thrived in the cold, had tried to extinguish the one thing that had bloomed for his mother. The hollow echo he'd been feeling for days now had a name. It was shame. He left his mother's house in a fugue state, the polite excuses he'd made for his abrupt departure feeling like ash in his mouth. The city, once a symbol of his dominion, now seemed like a monument to his own callousness. Every towering skyscraper, every speeding car, every faceless person in the crowd was part of a world he had shaped with force and fear, a world where an act of simple kindness was so rare it was spoken of as a miracle. And he, in his blind rage, had attacked it. He had tried to crush it under his heel like a weed. He drove himself, pushing the powerful car through traffic with a recklessness that mirrored the turmoil in his soul. He didn't go to his office. He didn't go to his apartment. He went back to the street where her shop was. He parked across the road and watched. It was late now, the sky a deep, bruised purple. The other shops were dark, their metal grates pulled down for the night. But a single, bare bulb cast a weak, yellow light from within the plywood-covered storefront of petal and stem. He could see her silhouette moving inside. After a long moment, he got out of the car, his movement stiff, his expensive Italian shoes silent on the pavement. He crossed the street and stopped in the gaping doorway. The interior was even worse up close. It was clean, swept of the larger debris, but the scars were everywhere. Gouges in the floorboards. The ghost outline of the counter that was no longer there. The air still held a faint, funereal scent of decay. Lena was sitting on an overturned crate, a small bundle of wires and floral tape in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration as she repaired a delicate stem. She must have sensed his presence, because she slowly looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them. He had expected fear, or anger, or hatred. Instead, there was just a profound, bone-deep weariness, and a flicker of recognition. The power dynamic had been shattered. In this broken space, he was not the formidable leader of the Kuriyamagumi. He was simply the man who had done this. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. He finally found his voice, though it sounded foreign and inadequate to his own ears. "I am responsible for this." She didn't react, her gaze unwavering. She simply set down the stem she was mending with deliberate care. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet, without tremor, but it cut through him more effectively than any shouted accusation could have. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and asked a question that dismantled his entire world. "But do you know why? Or was it just noise?" It wasn't a demand for an explanation. It was a search for meaning in the meaningless, a genuine, soul-bearing question that laid his motives bare and found them wanting. It had been noise. Senseless, arrogant, destructive noise. And for the first time in his life, Rio had no answer. His first, deeply ingrained instinct was to solve the problem with the only tool he truly understood: money. It was the universal solvent, capable of dissolving guilt, repairing damage, and resetting the board. He reached into his coat, pulling out a checkbook and a pen, the familiar weight of them a small comfort in his unsteady hands. "I will pay for everything," he said, his voice a low, formal declaration. "Name your price. I will have a new shop built for you. Twice the size." With the best materials, he held out the pen, an offering he believed no one could refuse. It was a gesture of absolute power, an attempt to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond his comprehension. Lena looked from the checkbook to his face, and a faint, sad smile touched her lips. She shook her head slowly. "You can't buy back what you broke." Her words were soft, yet they landed with immense force. This wasn't just glass and wood. This place was built with hands. It was built with time. "You can't write a check for that." She stood up, brushing the dust from her dress, and faced him fully. For a man who commanded legions and inspired fear with a single glance, he felt remarkably small under her steady, unimpressed gaze. She was right. He had offered a transaction, a cold and simple exchange of currency for absolution. But what he had taken from her was not something that had a price tag. He had violated her sanctuary, her history, the very spirit of her work. He stood there, the checkbook feeling foolish and obscene in his hand. His power, his wealth, his reputation, they were all useless here. They were the wrong tools for this kind of repair. He saw then that redemption could not be purchased. It had to be earned. It had to be built, with hands and with time. A new understanding began to dawn on him, a terrifying and liberating thought. To fix this, he would have to dismantle the man he had been. He put the checkbook away. The next evening, he returned. He wore old trousers and a simple dark shirt, not his usual tailored suit. He didn't bring his men. He came alone. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her sort through salvaged pots. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He simply picked up a discarded broom from a corner and began to sweep the fine layer of dust and grit from the floor. He was clumsy, awkward, the movements unfamiliar. Lena stopped her work and watched him, her expression unreadable. She didn't thank him. She didn't tell him to leave. She simply turned back to her pots, and in that shared, silent labor, something new and fragile began to take root in the ruins. Days bled into a week, then 2. Rio's presence at the shop became a strange, unspoken routine. He would arrive after his other, darker business was concluded for the day, shedding his identity as the head of the Koryamagumi at the broken door. He learned to pry warped floorboards, to sand splintered wood until it was smooth beneath his fingertips, to spackle and paint walls. His hands, accustomed to the cold steel of a weapon or the smooth glass of a whiskey tumbler, grew rough and calloused. He learned the satisfying ache of physical labor, the quiet pride of seeing a tangible result of his efforts. The work was a penance, a silent apology written in sweat and sawdust. They began to talk. The conversations were stilted at first, circling around the practical tasks at hand. "Pass me the hammer. Do you think this shelf is level?" But slowly, the space between them filled with more than just the sounds of rebuilding. He started asking about the flowers. He learned their names and their languages. Carnations for pride, lavender for devotion, rosemary for remembrance. One afternoon, as she was gently repotting a bruised but living orchid, he asked about the hellebore, the winter rose. "It's a symbol of serenity," she explained, her fingers working deftly in the rich soil. Of finding peace and beauty in the middle of hardship. It blooms when everything else is dormant and cold, he understood. It was her flower. He found himself looking at the world differently, through her eyes. He began to notice the small, tenacious weeds growing in the cracks of the pavement, the way the late afternoon sun illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. His world of sharp, dangerous angles was slowly being softened by her appreciation for subtle, resilient beauty. He started bringing 2 cups of coffee with him in the evenings. She started leaving a small paper bag with a pastry from Mr. Henderson's bakery on the crate where he left his coat. One night, while clearing a pile of debris, he found a small, water-damaged photo frame. Inside, a faded picture showed a much younger Lena beside an older woman with the same kind eyes, both of them smiling, their hands covered in dirt. "My grandmother," Lena said softly, coming to stand beside him. "She taught me everything. She said that to make something grow, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty." He looked down at his own calloused, dirt-streaked hands and felt a profound, aching connection to a legacy of creation, so different from his own legacy of destruction. He finally spoke of his own family, just a few words. "My mother is unwell. She loves your flowers." It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever admitted to anyone. Lena just nodded, her silence a vessel of pure, uncomplicated empathy. The day the last pane of glass was fitted into the new window frame felt like a momentous occasion. The shop was reborn. It wasn't larger or grander than before, but it felt stronger, imbued with a new history. Every shelf he had hung, every wall he had painted, was a testament to his atonement. The space was no longer just hers, it was theirs, a place they had reclaimed from violence together. For the reopening, Lena didn't want a grand celebration. She wanted a quiet beginning. The first person to step through the door that morning was Yuki. Rio stood beside her, his arm gently supporting his mother's. Her eyes, bright and clear, took in the beautifully restored space, filled once again with the vibrant colors and scents of living things. She looked from the shelves of flowers to Lena, who stood behind the new counter, a clean white apron tied over her gray dress. Then she looked at her son, standing proudly in the middle of it all, his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up. She saw the fine layer of sawdust that still clung to his dark trousers. She saw the change in him, a softening around his eyes, a quiet humility in his posture that had never been there before. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. Rio stepped forward. He was holding not a box or an envelope, but a single, small terracotta pot. Inside, nestled in dark, rich soil, was a perfect winter rose hellebore, its deep burgundy petals nodding gently. He placed it on the counter in front of Lena. "For blooming in the cold," he said, his voice low, the words carrying a weight of shared meaning that only they could understand. He was talking about the flower, about her, and about the fragile, unlikely thing that had begun to grow between them. Lena reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she accepted the pot. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a current of warmth through him that thawed a part of his soul he thought had been frozen forever. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the light pouring through the new window, and for the first time, her smile was not just for a customer or a neighbor. It was for him. He remained in the shop long after his mother had left, watching Lena as she moved with familiar grace through her reclaimed sanctuary, tending to her flowers, helping the customers who trickled in. He was no longer an intruder or a penitent. He was simply Rio, a man standing in a flower shop, a place of quiet beauty he had once destroyed and then helped to rebuild. The late afternoon sun streamed through the glass, illuminating the space in a warm, golden light. It fell across the counter, catching the deep, rich color of the hellebore he had given her. It sat there, a quiet promise of serenity, of resilience, of a new season. He watched her gently misting the leaves of a fern, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was the most valuable thing he had ever helped to build. This was his redemption, and perhaps his beginning.